Tonight we welcome local writer and historian Vince Burns, who worked in book and database publishing for many years. He's written a book on global terrorism, and with this book with Stephen Bates, Rincon Point. He has a doctorate degree in history from the University of Wisconsin on Wisconsin. And then we also have Stephen Bates, professor of journalism at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, running Rebs. He's the author of 5 books, most recently Rincon Point with, of course, Vince Burns, as well as articles in the Washington Post magazine, The Atlantic, and American Heritage. He holds an AB and a JD from Harvard University, which I heard is a good school. His great-grandfather acquired Rancho El Rincon in 1885, and it remained in the family for more than a century. Welcome, gentlemen.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you, Michael, for arranging this. I can only go back to about 1983 with Chaucer's, but I feel it's pretty far back. And now, actually, Michael made our day back in January when Michael said, "Oh, we've sold a lot of your book on Rincon Point," and he said 100 copies, and I'm sure they've all been returned by now,
No,
Michael. But
it's about doubled now.
but that was so gratifying because we were hoping to have some interest in the book, and so that was just a great feeling, and the fact that Chaucer's is out competing an electronic website that still sells books is just great. Is great. So yeah, we wrote this book, so we'll dive right in on the next slide. So I'll just give a quick introduction and talk a little bit about the Chumash, an important part of the Rincon story, and then Stephen's going to come up and tell us about a wonderful mysterious murder that happened at Rincon Point
Whoa.
back in the old days, and then I'll talk a little bit about the bohemian 50s and early 60s at Rincon, and then some of the challenges Rincon has had, and then the best for last, we'll talk about the surfing part. So the next slide. So just to I think we all know where Rincon is. The early surfers used to call it 3 Mile, because it was 3 miles south of the Carpinteria train station, supposedly. And just like the rest of California, you can see Rincon's changed a little bit over the years. So it's gone from just a couple people and some fields to 70 homes and 2 parks. And on the next slide, we can see a little bit more. This is 100 years almost exactly in between the old days at Rincon Point. And those are probably actually Indian middens, because they're not there anymore, right there at the point, those hills. They may be partly sand dunes and partly Indian Native American middens. And then Rincon does get a little crowded at the Rincon Classic. But yeah, just a little bit about the Native Americans. So you could see why they wanted to live at Rincon. It was a beautiful place. You know, just one point after another, you sort of can imagine what it was like even in this historical photo. The next one. So these are all Chumash villages in the area, and I got the arrow pointed to what was called Shuku, which is what the Chumash called Rincon Point. And don't worry, I'm not going to tell you all these dates here, but I thought that it was interesting that one Spanish explorer in 1770 said that I think there's 60 huts or 60 of these structures at Rincon Point, because that's exactly how many houses are at Rincon Point right now. So it's sort of fun to think of sort of Chumash Rincon actually having more people than live now at Rincon Point, which is sort of interesting. And plenty of wonderful artifacts have been found at Rincon Point. A lot of them are at the Natural History Museum in Santa Barbara. These are actually some fancy stuff that's been found at Rincon. This is steatite, which only occurs locally at Catalina. So this stuff came all the way from Catalina. It was probably manufactured on Catalina Island and then brought for trade to Shuku or Rincon. And the one on the right is a smoking pipe. We don't know exactly what was being smoked in there, but you can use your imagination. And then on the left, just a pot, and this is steatite was useful stuff because you could heat it up without it didn't break. Next slide. Some jewelry that's been found at Rincon Point by the archaeologists, and sort of a new theory that came out of UCSB, well, not new, goes back to I think the 90s now, is that the Chumash actually used these olivella beads as money, and that they actually served as money in prehistoric times. Next slide. So each one of these shaded, this is Rincon Point, and then each shaded spot is a separate excavation. So most of Rincon's been excavated, which is good. So we have all these wonderful artifacts. And unfortunately, it's also good because now, ever since the freeway, they pretty much wiped out the construction of 101, or of the sort of modern 101, did a number on where a lot of the traces of the Chumash were, and not too much turns up, although a few exceptions. So this is a sort of a fun story. One of the developers on the east side of Rincon Point naturally took one of the best lots for himself, and this was his house, and in sort of a revenge of the Chumash situation, one day a skeleton, he was having a koi pond built in his backyard, and a skeleton turned up, and it turned out not to be a recent skeleton, but a prehistoric skeleton. It was sort of a political debate what to do about the skeleton. The fact that Rincon's pretty much on the county line added to the jurisdictional stuff. But eventually his entire backyard was dug up, which is pretty bad, by the Santa Barbara Natural History Museum, and this big dig was conducted. They didn't find too much, but what was interesting is they did find another skeleton, and that skeleton turned out to have exostosis, which is surfer's ear, which is so amazing to think that so the Chumash, I'm not saying they were surfing, but the gentleman was probably out there helping with their big tomos, the ships they use, their sort of canoes they use. So he probably got that surfer's ear from fishing or using nets or so on. But it's a pretty interesting story, I thought. This is actually also blows my mind. These are records from that have been translated, obviously, from the Ventura mission, and these list actual Chumash folks who were married at the Ventura mission who were born at Rincon, who were born at Shuku, so, which is really amazing. So then what John Johnson did at the Natural History Museum in his dissertation was he actually took these names and then just did traditional genealogical work. So where are these people now? Where are their relatives? And so he was actually able to create a list of, people walking around Ventura County, Santa Barbara County, who are descended from the people who lived at Rincon Point in prehistoric times, which is just amazing to me. Kevin, Stephen's going to tell us about a murder here.
Okay, I'm going to talk about a couple of scandals involving Rincon Point, both of which started on Rincon Point and continued in Santa Barbara. The first is a love triangle murder from 1875. This is a sketch by Edward Vischer from 1865. You can see a stagecoach at left heading toward Rincon Creek. Rincon Creek was the site of the stagecoach station. It was on the Ventura side. And across from it on the Santa Barbara side was a farm owned by John Norton with a small farmhouse. It was a few hundred yards from the beach. John Norton lived there with his wife, Caroline, called Carrie, their young son and daughter, plus a hired hand, a former sailor named Jack Cotton, who used various aliases and had a criminal record. This is their neighbor, Andrew Baylord. In April 1875, Carrie told Baylord that her husband John had died while looking at property near Los Angeles, and his dying wish was that Baylord would help her sell everything they owned and give her the money. So he did that. She left Carpinteria. About a month later, Baylord got a letter from the dead man's sister, from John Norton's sister, saying, "I hear my brother is dead. You know what happened to him? Do you know what happened to his belongings? Also, apparently, his widow, Carrie Norton, has remarried, and her new husband is somebody named Jack Cotton. So Baylord later testified that aroused my suspicion, and he got several neighbors to search the farm and the beach. This is, Vince showed this. This is Rincon Point about 40 years later, but it probably looked about like this in the 1870s, just empty sand and dunes. Baylord poked around with an iron rod and on a sand mound hit something 2 feet down, and they dug up a decomposing corpse wearing John Norton's wool coat. So newspapers held off publishing it first while the police looked, but then finally the story was published. The governor offered $500 for their capture. Carrie Norton and Jack Cotton were arrested in Wadsworth, Nevada, where Cotton had gotten a job working for the railroad. And the sheriff took them back to San Francisco by train first, just in a regular passenger car. So at each stop, people would get on the train and walk through to get a look at them. And then back to Santa Barbara. Cotton went on trial first. He testified on his own behalf and gave long interviews to newspapers. And he said that Carrie Norton had hired hitmen to kill her husband, and that his only involvement was helping to bury the body. He said that Carrie was so cold-hearted she had told her children to play on the sand mound where the husband was buried, so as to to take away any disturbances. And he said that when the family dog was sniffing and digging on the sand mound, that she killed it. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. There was outrage in Santa Barbara. Everybody had expected hanging, including Cotton. Carrie Norton next went on trial in the Santa Barbara courthouse, and her account on the witness stand was that Cotton had killed her husband in Los Angeles and told her to come join him, and said, "I killed your husband because I am determined to have you." And he essentially then kidnapped her and her children and took them to San Francisco and then Nevada. There was a hung jury. She was retried right away. Key evidence at the trial was a studio photo of Jack Cotton and Carrie Norton that had been taken while they were on the lam in San Francisco. Her attorneys tried to get it excluded from evidence and failed. This is the photo from the Gled Hill Library here at the Historical Museum. Cotton testified that it was Carrie's idea to get this picture taken, and that she bought a $140 silk dress for the occasion. She testified that he forced her to pose for the picture, that he had a gun in his pocket, and that she was scared to death. The prosecutor told the jurors, "Look at her hands. Does she look as if she's scared to death, or does she look as if she is the mistress of the situation?" This is the jury's verdict form. They found her guilty. She was sentenced also to life. Jack Cotton and Carrie Norton were both sent to San Quentin. Now, some people at the time talked of an alternative theory for the murder, namely that John Norton burst into the bedroom and found his wife in bed with Jack Cotton, and then got into a fight with Cotton, who killed him. But the sexual mores of the time made that defense untenable. But it may have influenced governors of California. Both the sentences of both Cotton and Carrie Norton were commuted later in the century by governors. And both of them lived to ripe old ages. He died in a veterans home in 1910, aged around 87. And she died in 1938 in Oakland, aged 89. So from the murder of John Norton to a scandal at a roadhouse on Rincon Point. Some background first. This is Dr. Reuben W. Hill, who was a Civil War veteran. He, in 1875, married Maria del Carmen Gutierrez, and they farmed and lived on the Santa Barbara side of Rincon Point. He died in 1912. His family stayed on there. This is the path of Rincon Creek as of 1904. That's when this map was made. It had been the same path in 1872 when the state created Ventura County. When the state did that, they made Rincon Creek the county line between Santa Barbara and Ventura County. So that's the county line as of 1904. There was a flood in 1914 that cut a new channel straight to the sea. This is a Southern Pacific map from around 1915. This new channel in the flood of 1914 is important because the Hill family farmhouse had been right about where the new channel of the creek was. This was big news in Santa Barbara that the Hill family farmhouse had been washed away. And shortly after the flood, the Hill family actually posed at the site of where the house had formerly been. That's Mrs. Hill in the back. One last point about Rincon Creek, you may know this. When a waterway like a creek changes its path very gradually, then a county line, for example, moves with it. If a waterway changes very suddenly, as in a flood, then the county line stays put where it used to be. So this flood changed suddenly, and therefore the county line remained where it was, here in the red. One of the Hill family daughters, named Ruby Hill, married a guy named Bert Clark, and they decided to start a hotel and roadhouse on the Hill family property here in Santa Barbara County. So that's the county line is the red line there. The Clarks built Hotel Rincon. It went through various names after that, and it opened in 1915. It was immersed in scandals right away. There was underage drinking, drunken car wrecks, prostitution, and unsavory men from Los Angeles. As a result of which the Clarks couldn't get a liquor license, they moved away. There then was a series of managers, and finally a guy named Harry Goldflam took over in 1919. This is the hotel around that time, the hotel in the early 1920s. You can see the hay wagon in front of the hotel. The ban on liquor had a big impact on the Rincon Inn, as it was then called. The Santa Barbara Morning Press said it had been long known as an oasis to the bibulously inclined. So, as I said, the hotel was on Hill family property in Santa Barbara County, but there's a popular legend holding that it actually straddled the county line. So it was half Santa Barbara, half in Ventura County. The source is apparently this woman, Sally Stanford, a former bootlegger and madam who published her memoir in 1966. She claimed the county line ran right through the middle of the restaurant, and therefore when Santa Barbara County officers raided the place, everybody would scurry to the Ventura side where they could not be arrested, and vice versa. So, she said, you just couldn't take a tumble in this place unless both county policemen arrived at the same time, and somehow this simultaneous action never occurred to them. There are several problems with that story. The first is Prohibition was enforced largely by federal agents who don't care much about county lines. The second is the Hill property ended at the county line. If it extended into Ventura County, it extended onto somebody else's property, namely Dr. Charles Bell Bates. And last but not least, the hotel did get raided just 7 months into Prohibition by federal agents who were working alongside the sheriff's offices of Santa Barbara County and Ventura County. Harry Goldflam was arrested for violating Prohibition. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to Santa Barbara County Jail for 4 months. He applied for a presidential pardon. Only a few weeks were left on his 4-month sentence, and he got it. President Warren G. Harding commuted his sentence and ordered him released from prison, from county jail immediately. There was outrage in Santa Barbara over this. Many people suspected some sort of skullduggery, friends in high places, corruption, bad influence, bribery. This is Attorney General Harry Daugherty and President Warren Harding who were responsible for the pardon. The Harding administration, as you may know, was famously corrupt, including pardons. But I looked at the Gold Flam pardon file from the National Archives. 4 doctors said he was seriously ill. The trial judge and the U.S. attorney both recommended his release. It is surprising that Gold Flam petitioned President Harding for a pardon. It is surprising that he got one. The biggest surprise is that it was legitimate, as far as we know. So finally, a little bit about 101 and some other passages by Rincon Point. First, a little bit of prehistory. This is another sketch by Edward Fisher of a stagecoach. This is probably around La Conchita. The topography doesn't look quite right, but there was a big storm at the time. He said it was quite thrilling to, stagecoaches went on the beach, and during storms and high tides, they had to just get up right against the cliffs and wait it out. This is the railroad construction in 1887, the railroad crew camping on Rincon Point. John Woodward, who collects photos, old antique photos in Santa Barbara, found this for us. This may be the earliest photo, at least the earliest I've found of Rincon Point. So the county deeded a right-of-way to the railroad because it thought the train was basically the final stage in the evolution of transportation. No further improvements would be possible. So that's where the train went. Then came automobiles. The train took the best path, so they had to drive on the beach, the way the stagecoach formerly had, and they too could not pass at high tide. After that came the Rincon Causeway, wooden causeway, completed in 1912. Initially, the nails would supposedly get dislodged from the vibrations, and people would have blowouts one after another, just crossing over it. After a few years, the causeway was paved, but remained there. In the 1920s, it was replaced with a seawall and a regular road. This is from the 1930s, by which time there were perfectly fine roads and no excuses for this kind of misadventure, except poor judgment. That's my father on the right, Bobby Bates. In 1944, the road intersecting 101 became Bates Road. It was widened in 1949 from 2 lanes here to 4 lanes. So this is about what it looked like then. In the late 1950s, Caltrans decided they needed to expand it once again. What they ended up doing basically is widening it and straightening it where it was, which sounds simple, but it wasn't. Accomplishing that took a huge amount of work. This is part of the construction. You can see they shaved off the sides of 2 hills and moved the soil to create a plateau in the canyon. Supposedly 5 million cubic yards of soil. This is the foreman, Barney Connaughton, around 1970. They just destroyed the natural contours of the land. You can see, you might think it's a kind of desecration. It turns out it could have been much worse. Caltrans actually favored a different route, which was going to go inland. This is 1950s 101. What Caltrans wanted to do, instead of widening it where it was cut through 2 hills and fill in part of a canyon, which would have resulted in something like this. Caltrans liked this better because the price was about the same, and it had the advantage of not having to interrupt traffic. They could keep traffic going around. Now, a leading opponent of this was R.W. Bates, who ranched there and who was my grandfather, and he was responsible more than anyone for the development of Rincon Point. He and other farmers argued that there was going to be a serious damage of frost to their crops if you cut a new hole through these 2 hills. That's the farmers. You might think that the residents of Rincon Point would be thrilled to get the freeway away from their backyards, the noise, the fumes. But it turns out if the freeway went inland, then the old freeway, the 101 now, would become a county road where parking would be permitted. And they feared it would mean a vast increase in the number of surfers. One Rincon Point residents said they already couldn't leave their patio furniture outdoors because surfers would steal it and use it for bonfires. So Caltrans went with the second choice. This is what ended up happening. But it could have been worse. One last road-related anecdote. R.W. Bates, my grandfather, remained active on the ranch in his old age. Here he is with two men who worked on the ranch when he was about 89. He had long-standing vision problems, and in fact, when I was a kid, we used to listen to recorded books he got from the Library of Congress for the blind. It was a special program for the blind. He also continued driving. In 1975, he went over a cliff. He went over a ranch road cliff. The car crashed by Rincon Creek at the bottom of the canyon. He bounced out partway down, and I always thought his life was saved by the fact he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Here they are rescuing him. You can see the car down at the bottom. His eyeglasses fell out of his pocket during the rescue, and he sent his grandson Ned down to find them a short time later, who did amazingly find them. R.W. said he wanted the car left in place, and apparently it is still there. Someone set fire to it at one point. He lived 3 more years. He died in 1978 at age 90. As I said, he was key in the development of Rincon Point, and a little ways up Rincon Creek, there's this hidden monument to him, still there. So, that's it for me.
Very nice.
I know.
Perfect, yeah. Got Rincon royalty here. Got a Bates, that's pretty good, huh?
Yeah.
I just wanted to go, just mention, obviously anyone who lives in a $5 million house on Rincon Point doesn't have too much to gripe about probably, but Rincon has had some challenges over the years. We just heard about some of them, murder and whatnot. But the biggest challenge for Rincon Point has been flooding, right? So Rincon Point exists because of Rincon Creek, but sometimes Rincon Creek takes away. And that was one of the Bates's early cottages there, moving. Stephen has a great sort of traced in those days, you just, your cabin was washed off the foundation, you just move it somewhere else. And so this cabin, or this cottage seems to have moved a couple places on Rincon Point. And this is one of Stephen's uncle's great achievements was building this bridge, which lasted until, I think about 1980-ish, late 70s, to get to his own home across Rincon Creek. And this is that bridge under threat from a flood in '52. Another big challenge at Rincon has been, oil. This is sort of hard to believe, but in the early '60s, everyone was excited about the oil potential of Southern California, especially of Rincon and Santa Barbara in general. And this is a map. This is sort of like a lease map where the oil companies were sort of greedily looking at, which parts of the Santa Barbara Channel they were going to buy. This is all early '60s. And this headline's sort of hard to believe that they were actually contemplating 75 offshore oil. Can you imagine if that had happened? And instead, what happened was in January '69, we had the Great Santa Barbara oil spill, which would actually change American history in a way, because it's really played a major role in the American environmental movement, because it was such a disaster, and the oil did hit Rincon. Because we had the 50-year anniversary right before COVID in 2019, there was some local interest in what had happened, and and the great activism that happened. But it was a terrible disaster. The crews came out to try and clean up everything, but this poor surfer is a mess. You can see. Next slide. The other great challenge is what's called the effluent of the affluent problem. So Rincon has had this, existed happily with septic tanks for decades and decades and decades, and this is a picture that I think Stephen's father took actually, and I circled one of the outhouses there at Rincon Point, which happens to be essentially right on the creek, which is pretty alarming, really, when you think about it. I don't know if anyone remembers, but in the 90s and early 2000s, there was just a gigantic fight at Rincon over whether and how to connect it to the sewer system, and it finally did happen. And surprisingly enough, or not surprising, the water is much cleaner now, thank goodness. So the good guys won. Another part of Rincon's sort of less positive history, I guess, is it's in the pandemic. So just like everything else, Rincon was shut down. Here's a great quote from a surfing contact. During early 2020, the cove pumped for weeks with almost nobody around. And this, I love this picture where Santa Barbara County is essentially telling people not to come to the beach. I guess it was better to stay at home and give each other COVID than go and get fresh air, right? And this is a photo my mom took. She basically had the beach to herself and the dog. So sort of an interesting part of Rincon's history. And its relationship with animals has also been, you're right there, at the interface. And here's a sea lion at my grandmother's house, basically taking shelter from an El Nino. Here's, I don't know if anyone's heard this story, but this actually happened at Rincon. Poor black bear, went on a huge walkabout from the Carpinteria, the mountains there, and made it all to the beach and spent a pretty good day at the beach. And then the next day wasn't so good for the bear, and I won't tell you what happened, but you can imagine. And here's a hopeful story, actually. Caltrans, apparently with some of their billions of dollars that were allocated a few months or years ago, is making noises about trying to protect the famous Rincon Creek trout, which used to be a great delicacy, and I think was fished into the 50s, maybe even into the 60s at the creek. So someday maybe we'll have those trout back. But let's move on to surfing, right? So go back, Steve. Yeah, so these are all pictures from the Rincon Classic, which is the great surfing event at Rincon every year, and you can see it's pretty hard to take a bad picture at Rincon. They're all pretty good, and I call this the surfing history of Rincon is unique, not because we did a unique job, but just because it's a great story, in that it's a local story, and famous surfers came from LA and came up here. Or came up to Rincon and surfed, but it's really been the best parts of the story of Rincon surfing, I think, are include the locals, and that sometimes folks coming down from LA maybe that it was harder getting used to the situation. The Rincon Classic is sort of part of that story, because it's just for locals, really. You have to be in the 805 area code, really, to take part in the Rincon Classic, so that's why I call it a unique history. Here's some of the earliest surfers that are known pre-war, so pre-World War II. Often lifeguards sort of led the way because they had access to these big, huge boards that they would rescue people on, and I guess it was a natural thing to ride them in right after you've saved somebody or something. So this is an early crew from from Carpinteria. And here's one of them surfing right out in front of Rincon in the late 30s, which is pretty impressive. Gates Foss.
Wow.
Next slide. So this is actually the photo we have on the cover of our book, and just for fun I colorized it. Dick Metz is one of the names you hear about in the early, sort of in the 1950s part of Rincon's story, and these are some of his buddies. A lot of these guys were from the university. It was called the University of Santa Barbara then, and so it was sort of the predecessor to UCSB. And you can see they're having a lot of fun. This is a historic scarfed board here, right, with the front end tipped up. And Dick Metz is still going strong at 90-something years old. He has his own surfing museum in San Clemente, and I thought he was the one who took this picture, but I recently found out it was actually someone else. Next slide. Another great character in the early history of Rincon surfing is this guy Billy Meng, who also wonderfully is still alive. I just found out. and apparently lives in San Ynez. He was a campground host for decades and decades in the mountains behind us here. And Billy Meng, their work, I met someone who's working on a book connected with Billy Meng, and which is just, I think it's going to be his sort of oral history, and he was a character, let me tell you. Anyway, here's another early surfing character or figure in the history of Rincon. Ken Keeson. You can see he's wearing a Rincon shirt, which is sort of fun. It's still pre-Gidget era, but things are changing. And one of the early sources I found for the surfing history of Rincon was this scrapbook that someone at the point had kept. And one of the things mentioned in the scrapbook is oh, this book just came out. It's sort of getting a lot of attention. So Gidget the book is actually a pretty good read. Gidget the movie is a little too saccharine for me, but the book is a little spicy. But either way, the whole thing changed. Surfing just exploded in California, and Rincon was just part of that story. So already by '59, it's crowded, which I think is really interesting. Seems to be crowded. Here's a story in the Carp newspaper saying, hey, this thing, surfing is sort of catching on, which is sort of a fun story. And then within a year or two, the Surfer magazine had discovered Rincon, and this right here is a famous photo of Kemp Auberg. He's doing this, what do we call it, Bill?
Soul arch.
A soul arch. And he's surfing Rincon in the photo, and it actually became like the logo for Surfer magazine. It became such a sort of iconic image. And unfortunately, we just lost Kemp Auberg last year. But here's a picture of his brother, Denny, with probably the most famous surfer of all time, Mickey Dora and John Peck. So these are two guys from LA and a local. And the boards are famous, and it's just an iconic photo. And this is my other favorite photo from Rincon. This is the Carpinteria 1967 yearbook, if you could believe it. My yearbook never had anything so interesting.
No.
It was just incredibly beautiful, like almost heartbreaking photo. It's so beautiful, I think. This photo is actually what got me interested in this project. And here's another gentleman from the picture. Just explaining how his Yater spoon was just perfect for the point.
Wow.
Another Rincon legend is George Greenough. If anyone's heard of him, it just lives in Australia. Incredible innovator, and an incredible sort of legend now. One of the things George does now that he's in his 80s is he was involved in what might be considered Rincon's most famous wave. So this is the 1969 swell. So after you had this horrible year of that started off with the oil spill, at the end of the year you had this tremendous swell that sort of redeemed the year. George, 50 years later, tried to remember that wave, and so this is him with a bunch of sort of oceanographic bathyrhythmic charts trying to explain why it was that wave broke so far out and was different than all the other waves, and it was just a great story. So he wrote this up recently for this Australian newspaper. Bill knows this photo. So this is maybe one of the most famous photos from Rincon. This is Steve Bissell, who's local photographer, and it's also a great story. He snuck up to Stephen's grandfather's place up on the top of the hill and took this amazing photo. It was in Surfer Mag, I think it was in Surfer, and it became sort of it was a centerfold, so it was in the dorm rooms and bedrooms of a million boys and girls across the country, and you know, just a beloved photo. Stephen's grandfather supposedly heard about the photo. As sort of a joke, he called Stephen Bissell up and said that he was trespassing when he took it, and that he had to answer for that. Just teasing him. Anyway, Steve went up to try and make amends with Stephen's grandfather, and of course Stephen's grandfather just gave him some bags of avocados and asked for a copy of the photo signed. So everything turned out all right. Later on, it became standard practice that a lot of people wanted to take that same photo. This is Don Balch another well-known Rincon photographer. And Don's also famous because he came up with this wonderful marketing slogan, Queen of the Coast, which is now, sort of what every real estate agent talks about in terms of Rincon property and whatnot. So he came up with this tagline for an article about Rincon Point in Surfer. Here's just one of the most famous surfers from the 80s, Tom Curran at Rincon. And his counterpart, equally famous woman surfer, Kim Merrick, about the same time at Rincon. Here's some Jimmy Medico photos, which I just think are beautiful, sort of scenery from the 80s. There were great El Niños at the time. Don Bush also organized a longboard contest, and this is the crazy wetsuits that everyone was wearing in the mid 80s. And ironically, I think Chris Keat, the folks who organized the Rincon Classic, are about to restart and have the first longboard contest this fall, sort of continuing this tradition that started way back 40 years ago. And I just wanted to make sure we included some women surfers. Simone Redingius is both a photographer and a surfer, and here she is at the Rincon Classic, looking pretty good. And the sort of, I think of the modern era in Rincon as sort of the Rincon Classic era. So you have all these gorgeous photos. So this is the famous wave I was just talking about. But then what's interesting is this is actually from this January.
Wow.
Almost the same, it looks like the same way. Just to show that, I guess, the continuity. So even though there hasn't been much surf for months now, we did have some big swells back in the winter. And I just wanted to mention one of the fun things about working on the project has been getting to meet folks like Bill, who's here, and here's drawing a blank.
Thank you.
Yeah, Denny Alberg, thank you, and Simone Redingius with our book. And here's another gorgeous Steve Bissell photo. So yeah, thank you for listening.
You.
Just a taste of.
Why don't you come on out here, Stephen? I got a couple questions, and then maybe we have some audience questions. If you guys can stand right in the middle there, if I can get both of you. How did you two come together to start this project, and how did it come about?
So, yeah, well, I was looking for a retirement project. I worked in publishing my career and had retired, and I knew a little bit about Arcadia Press, which is the publisher for these types of books, and their commitment to local history. And it sort of occurred to me that Rincon Point was a perfect subject. But I didn't really have, other than some experience with my grandmother and my mom having property there. I didn't really have any special knowledge, and fortunately, Stephen popped up and had all sorts of special knowledge and special information about Rincon Point. Yeah.
Vince was looking for photos, and that's how we connected.
Interesting.
I had no surfing photos at all, but I had a lot of other old photos.
But you have a lot of family history, Stephen. I was wondering, when you were a child, did your father and your grandfather kind of tell you about the history beforehand when you were young?
Yeah, they both did. I would just visit in summers, and I didn't grow up here, but my father grew up there, and yeah, they both thought history was important and talked a lot about it.
When you were visiting, what kind of impression did Rincon Point make on you?
I took it for granted.
Really?
It was this, a gorgeous thing that was part of the family and would be forever.
Did your family keep records and notes, and obviously the photo like of your father and your grandfather, but did they keep?
Yeah, my grandfather, with his sense of history, wrote a letter to his children every week for about 20 years and saved them all and had them bound just for himself. And it must be 4 or 5 volumes. It's a great sort of record of Rincon Point and the Rincon area in the 30s, 40s, into the 50s.
Wow. So
Stephen has, he's just, we just had time to just barely scratch the surface, but you have some amazing stories about your father running around Rincon Point in the 30s and
Wow.
finding the old oil wells, right? And,
Oh, yeah.
It's probably a good lesson, the fact that your grandfather did such a great job keeping track of writing. I mean, letter writing is almost a lost art now, right? And that he valued all that, and that you're able to take advantage of it now. So.
He wrote in his diaries in the 1920s that he really wished he had asked his father, who died 10 years earlier, questions. And 100 years later, I'm wishing that I'd asked him, and my father, questions.
Yeah, it's a good lesson for all of us.
Yeah.
We should ask the elders and keep track of what they said.
But the fact that you have what you have is, I think it's enough. I mean, for all of us to be able to enjoy. In terms of the process of you two working together, how did you divide it up, and how did you decide how to put the book together?
We went back and forth, decided on a list of chapters, and then divvied them up, and
Yeah.
traded photos going back and forth till we figured out what was where.
Yeah, and this series it has a set number of pages, but you can have there's plenty of flexibility in terms of how many photos. I'm a historian, so I dove into the history piece just because I thought it's really interesting in terms of how it connects with California history generally.
Definitely.
We see this crazy development that went on, which is just like the rest of of the state, and the fact that Rincon is this was lucky enough to be this important surf place, and how that the development of that tracks so much of what happened in post-war California with the development of the surfing technologies and the professionalization of surfing the way it is now, the fact that you have all these contests and so on. So I really love the connections with what was going on with the wider state history.
And the development of the development in some ways is interesting. My family first owned it in 1885,
Yeah.
and my great uncle, it was 750 acres or so. My great uncle said the least valuable part was Rincon Point.
Oh, okay.
Because it was
The land.
sand.
You're right,
Yeah.
You couldn't, run horses or cattle, or crops were a little dicey.
Yeah.
And now that part is worth far more than the other 740 acres.
One more question and a comment, actually. And what I really enjoy, we've sold a lot of books here, as I told you. But my favorite thing is when customers would come in and old surfers would come in and look. And they'd be like kids looking at the book, trying to find themselves or their friends in there. I think that's really, every time they do that, presents a good feeling. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the response you've been getting, because you've traveled and done some talks and things.
Oh yeah, well the in addition to the book and partly to help with the book, I've been writing this monthly column on the surf history of Rincon for the Carpinteria newspaper, and it's just been a joy to meet folks like Bill, who's in the audience, and other folks who made history at Rincon surfing, basically, and whether it's the generation from the 50s or the 60s and 70s, and it's just been wonderful. And in the case of the folks from the 50s, it's sort of like how we, the whole country dealt with the World War II generation, which pretty much is gone now, and those folks who were sort of famous in the 50s, unfortunately, aren't too numerous these days. And it's just a reminder to get, like we were just saying, just to get as much down in writing from their memories, because they lived in a California that doesn't exist anymore, which is really neat.
People have come up to us with photos and documents and things at these events we've done, connected with it.
Yeah. We've learned new things. So.
Well, you've given a gift to a lot of people, so just keep that in mind. So, do you have any questions, you guys?
I wanted to ask about the genealogical chart of the descendants of the Chumash.
Oh yeah.
I just thought that, where is that document actually? Is that at the museum?
Let me remember. That is from, okay, that is from a sort of semi-published archaeology report that concerned Rincon about 1980. So there was a big development in 1980, and sort of a lot of the old houses from the prior 50, 100 years
Right.
were wiped out. And even as happens nowadays, there was UCSB was asked to do a sort of an archaeological survey of what was there
What was
before it was
left.
going to be wiped out.
Yeah.
And that, I believe I took that pages from that report, and I could show, I'll let you know where it is if you
It's
want.
like in an
It's-
archive at UCSB. somewhere?
It's yes, that's about the right answer. Yeah, so it wasn't officially published, and but John Johnson's the guy. If you Google John Johnson, he's the I think he's now like the emeritus curator at the Natural History Museum. An amazing guy, knows amazing about he's sort of living expert on the Chumash history, and he developed that technique that I was talking about of taking these names from the mission records and then moving forward into the present and being able to track down folks, which of course is especially important now, with the current concerns with the native.
I thought that was amazing that was even possible.
I
you
did
know.
too. I did too. Thank
And,
you.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's- and
it's-
that's really neat that you have that history. In addition to all the other layers of history that you have for the
I mean,
Rincon,
yeah,
that you
could it-
have that too.
Yeah, I mean, just the idea that that there's someone out there whose direct relatives was born. And I just find that unbelievable.
Yeah.
And it shows how brief our history is in a way in California, right? It's not like it's 500 years ago. It's just 150 years ago.
Right. Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, thank you
Thank you.
very much
Yeah,
for
good
taking the
job.
time. to
Oh,
talk
yeah.
to us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Party looks